Welcome to this week's Week in Wisdom by Creating a Family. Creating a Family is a national support and training nonprofit for foster, adoptive, and kinship families. And this Week in Wisdom segment of our original podcast is a long-form, 1-hour interview podcast that drops on Wednesday. This segment drops on the weekends, hence the name Week in Wisdom, and we answer your questions. And it's short form, meaning that it shouldn't last more than about 10 or so minutes. So today I want to talk about embryo donation, which is sometimes called embryo adoption. Embryo donation is the donation of unused embryos by the parents that created them to another person or couple for family building. So let's go back to the beginning here. In vitro IVF cycles often result in more embryos than a patient can transfer. These unused embryos are usually frozen for the couple to attempt another pregnancy attempt. But some may remain after the couple or patient, it doesn't have to be a couple, completes their family building. They have a number of options on what to do with these frozen embryos, but one option for what to do is to donate the remaining embryos to another infertility patient for a frozen embryo IVF cycle. So one question that we get a lot, should it be called embryo donation or embryo adoption? So the Ethics Committee of the American Society of Reproductive Medicine has stated that the correct term for donating unused embryos to another couple for family building is called embryo donation rather than embryo adoption. And Creating a Family respects this position in our materials. But since many people looking for information on this option continue to call it embryo adoption, and they will use that in their search terms, we sometimes use both terms to aid in finding our materials. And also, I would say that there are a few adoption agencies that have an embryo donation program, and they follow the adoption model, and they call it embryo adoption. So that's kind of where we stand on that. So one question you have to have when you're thinking about using donated embryos to create your family is, so what's the success rate of this? So the success rate for embryo donation or embryo adoption, depending on how you call it, is similar to the success rate for IVF cycles using thawed embryos. And the Society of Assisted Reproductive Technology, something called SART, their data indicates that approximately 40% of embryo donation transfers result in a live birth. The percentage of frozen embryo transfers resulting in a live birth depends upon the age of the donating mother or the egg donor at the time the embryo was created, with obviously a younger woman having substantially greater success. And many donated embryos were created using donor eggs, and donors are usually in their 20s. So that's something to think about. Another common question is, where can I find donated embryos? Embryo donation you can use through a infertility clinic. Some of the things to note, infertility clinics treat this process very much as it's a frozen embryo transfer to them. They do not follow an adoption model at all. Usually, anonymous donations are the only option. There's no guarantee, honestly, that records with identifying information will be kept for a long time. So if that's important to you, it's something to think about. Most clinics require that you're already a patient at that clinic before being accepted into their embryo donation program. Now, that's not 100%, but that is the norm. And because of that reason, there's limited geographic dispersion, i.e., you're going to be using the donated embryo likely of another family using that clinic. So if that's important to you, that you have a great geographic dispersity, then this is not probably your best option. There are usually limited options for obtaining another embryo from the same batch of embryos if you wanted to have a genetic sibling for your child. There is not extensive evaluation done of the receiving families. There's not a home study or anything home study adjacent that is done. There's also limited education or preparation provided to the recipient family on issues related to non-genetic parenting, although some clinics require a session or two with a mental health professional. But again, education is not something that is being stressed. The cost for using embryos from an infertility clinic, it's going to be all these costs I'm going to give you are a fairly wide range, anywhere from $5,000 to, say, $10,000 would be what you would expect. Another option you have is embryo donation using an adoption agency. Again, I mentioned before that very often they call that embryo adoption. And they do that because they treat it as a form of adoption. Very often, both anonymous and some degree of shared information is usually available. So if you do not want to do it anonymously, and there are good reasons for the child that you might not want to do that, you may well have the option of some type of shared information. Records with identifying information will be kept permanently or at least very long term, so that if you or your child wants this information in the future, there is some reasonable assurance that it will be there. There is usually more geographic dispersion because most of these agencies recruit embryos and receiving families nationally. So the worry is less that your child will date or marry a genetic sibling. The programs differ on whether the receiving family selects the embryos they want to receive based on the profile prepared by the donating family, or is it reversed that the donating family selects the receiving family based on a profile they prefer, or whether it's mutual. So those options all exist. The level of contact between the donating and receiving family, if any at all, is mutually agreed upon in advance. It may be an option to receive another embryo in the same batch of frozen embryos if you were wanting a genetic sibling. That's something to ask if that's important to you. And as I mentioned, most agencies follow the adoption model and require the receiving families to have an extensive evaluation. It's akin to an adoption home study. Most adoption agencies with an embryo donation program have programs to prepare the receiving family for non-genetic parenting. That is a good thing, I think, but something to keep in mind. Not all infertility clinics will transfer embryos that were not created in their clinic. Therefore, it may be hard to find a clinic nearby you to transfer the frozen embryo when you are ready. So you'll have to add travel costs into another clinic that will actually do the transfer. The cost ranges from anywhere of $12,000 to $16,000 plus travel, obviously, if it's required. Another option is that there are a few medical clinics that specialize in embryo donation. There are only a few in the U.S. Honestly, I only know of two. And some use the adoption-based model, and some use the medical procedure model, and some offer both. Anonymous or some degree of shared information is usually available, although costs may be more if you choose to have the option to share information. Records with identifying information will be kept permanently or long term, but you'll need to confirm what procedures that clinic has in place for maintaining the records in the event that they close. And that's important because in the future, you or your child may need that information or want that information. Usually there is more geographic dispersion because they, again, recruit nationally. So they recruit both embryo donators as well as receiving families nationally. The level of contact between the donating and receiving family, if any, is mutually agreed upon in advance. And there may be an option to receive other embryos in the same batch if you know in advance that you want genetic siblings. The degree of recipient family evaluation, which again is something akin to a home study, differs depending on the program and the desire of both the donating family, which might want that, or the receiving family. Preparation for the recipient families for non-genetic parents is usually not as involved as with adoption agency programs. And at least one of those clinics requires that the recipient family travel to the clinic for a transfer, thus adding cost. And speaking of cost, the options for this are somewhere in the $11,000 to $17,000 plus travel. So that's something to consider. And your last option for where to find embryos, if you're looking to use donated embryos to create your family, is self-directed matches. You can do this online or through friends or acquaintances. Some families find each other online and then turn the actual process over to an adoption agency with an embryo donation program, while others just handle the entire process on their own. It's treated as a medical procedure if handled without the services of an adoption agency. And families are arranging the donation among themselves, so identifying information is obviously shared. And the degree of future communication or contact is worked out between the parties. There may be an option to receive other embryos in the same batch if you're trying for genetic siblings. Usually there is little formal evaluation of the recipient family unless an adoption agency is involved. And usually there is little formal education on non-genetic parenting for the recipient family, again, unless an adoption agency is involved. Not all infertility clinics, again, harkening back, are going to transfer embryos that were not created in their clinic. Therefore, if you can't find a clinic nearby, you're going to have to add cost to travel and finding a clinic that will transfer. And I can't stress this enough, the services of an attorney that specializes in reproductive law is required. And we have resources on our website, creatingafamily.org, to find one. And the cost for this option, anywhere from 8 to 12, and that would include frozen embryo transfer costs, the shipping, the legal, plus travel if it's required. I hope this is helpful. It's a great way to create your family and go into it with your eyes open and let us know how it turns out. Before you leave, let me remind you that we have 12 free courses on our website at creatingafamily.org. Hover over the word training, click on free courses at the end, or you can go to bit.ly/JBS support. These courses are free. They're 1 hour. You can get continuing ed if you need it. So check them out. And thanks for listening to this week's Weekend Wisdom. If you like it, please tell a friend to subscribe to the creatingafamily.org podcast. That's how you will get this in your feed. Thanks so much. See you next week.